From Utah.
Madam President, in less than a month, American taxpayers face the greatest tax increase in our nation's history. 2 years ago, the President and the Senate Democrats opted to postpone these tax increases for 2 years. They did so knowing that raising taxes in a weak economy is an unnecessary and counterproductive jolt to the system. 40 Democrats supported doing that. Since then, however, the President has been single-minded in arguing for tax increases on certain wealthy taxpayers. He and his Democratic friends promoted these tax hikes in the name of a so-called balanced approach to deficit reduction. And now, with the country fast approaching the fiscal cliff, it's time to pay the piper. But as the President issues ultimatums about what kind of tax increases are necessary to avert the fiscal cliff, it is worth noting that he has abandoned any pretense of seeking a balanced approach to deficit reduction. Last week's proposal from the White House amounts to little more than a massive set of tax increases. By the way, far in excess of the tax hikes that he ran on or anything that Senate Democrats would support, coupled with new spending. Even Democrats don't support what he called for. And his response to Speaker Boehner's balanced plan is raise taxes today, and next year we'll come back and discuss raising taxes again. The President's commitment to a balanced approach of new tax revenue and spending reforms has morphed post-election into new tax revenue and increased spending. And to cap it off, they have thrown in a fresh demand that would eliminate any limit on the federal debt. The proposal outlined by Treasury Secretary Geithner last week shows that if given a chance, Democrats will never use new taxes to reduce the deficit. They will instead use it to pay for larger government, more public workers, and more government waste. We need to have a serious conversation about our federal debt, which is now over $16.3 trillion and going up every day. How do we get that number under control? The President and his Democratic friends have suggested for years that they can do it on the revenue side, specifically by taxing the wealthy. Yet the new taxes on the rich promised by the President during the campaign would reduce the next 10 years of deficits by only 8%, assuming they didn't do any more spending. So where's the rest of the money going to come from? We need to have a serious conversation about spending, but so far the President, congressional Democrats, and the liberal interest groups that support them have refused to engage. All I can say is that Republicans are here, and we are ready to talk. We are ready to reach a balanced resolution that would spare the American people from the consequences of going over the fiscal cliff. And Madam President, I've only been here 36 years, but I've seen every president willing to meet on a regular basis at budget crunch time with people on both sides of the table over and over and over again until they gradually whittle it down to where they can agree. I haven't seen that with President Obama. I've even heard Democrats complain that he never talks to them. We cannot do this kind of work without very, very strong presidential effort. That's what presidents are for. And it can't just be laying down a gauntlet and saying, you can't cross over that, or drawing a line in the sand. You've got two programs now, and those two sides need to get together. And that includes the President and whatever Democrats he cares to put in the equation, and also Speaker Boehner, Leader McConnell, and others. As we attempt to reach a meaningful resolution of this debate in the coming weeks, there are three guideposts that I will keep in sight. First is the cliff itself. Going over it would be the height of irresponsibility. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, going over the cliff will reduce GDP to a negative 0.5% next year. throwing us back into a recession and causing unemployment to surge to 9.1% or more. But it seems increasingly clear that the President and Democrats in Congress are content to go over the cliff regardless of the outcome. I can't believe that that's so, but I've heard them say it. They think they'll have an advantage if we go over the cliff. Well, I hate to tell you, there'll be no advantage to that. Leading Democrats have expressed on several occasions their openness towards going over the cliff. The question is why? Why would the President do this? Why would Democrats jeopardize the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of American workers and the economic security of their families? Why are they putting raising tax rates on a few ahead of the well-being of all? Republicans are working to avoid this outcome. We want to avoid raising tax rates because we know once they're raised, they'll stay there, or there'll be another demand next year to raise them higher. We have a good argument for that. We believe it hurts the economy by harming incentives to work, save, and invest. Republicans have expressed some willingness to work with the President to raise revenue without raising tax rates, but the President refuses to budge. After all, he argued during his reelection that the deficit reduction math does not work otherwise. Now, this leads me to my second guidepost in this debate. It is the President's math that does not work, and his math is off in a multiplicity of ways. Let's start at the beginning. Last year's deficit was $1.3 trillion. Next year's deficit is likely to exceed $1 trillion for a fifth year in a row. So what would the President's tax hike proposal raise in terms of revenue? What would it have done to last year's $1.3 trillion deficit, and what would it do to reduce our debt over the long term? If all of the 2001 and 2003 tax relief were to expire, it would reduce the deficit by $426 billion over 1 year. To put it another way, the full extension of the current bipartisan tax relief would cost $426 billion over 1 year. Now, that's a lot of revenue. But the President and congressional Democrats, or at least most of them, have no desire to see all of this tax relief expire. In fact, their plan, should we go over the cliff, is to reinstate almost all of it. They say they only want to raise taxes on the rich. So how much would it cost if we extended current tax relief for everyone, but those making over $250,000, which some have said is the line for being rich? Assuming that the estate tax stays where it is, and a fair assumption given the level of support for that policy even among Senate Democrats, the cost of extending all of the tax relief, except for those individuals, would be $358 billion. And given that certain senators from high-income blue states are uncomfortable designating families making $250,000 a year as rich, it has been suggested that the current tax relief might be extended for everyone but so-called millionaires. Warren Buffett has said those earning $500,000 a year or more. But others have said millionaires. And how much would that cost? The one-year cost of that tax relief would be $383 billion. There are a few different ways that we can look at these numbers. One way is to compare the cost of the Democrats' tax plan with that of the Republicans. The one-year difference between the Republican proposal of extending all tax relief and the Democrats' proposal to raise taxes on the rich is at most $68 billion, and perhaps as low as $23 billion. Now, with a deficit of over $1 trillion, is the President really willing to send us over the cliff for as little as $23 billion in additional revenue? I can't believe that he is, but he is. Another way to look at the numbers is to compare the cost of the Democrats' actual plan with the President's stated desire to raise revenue by $1.6 trillion. He can't get that from just the rich. Even if he took every dollar that every millionaire earns this next year, he'd probably have a little less than $900 billion. And that may be high. I look forward to some enterprising reporter getting to the bottom of this one. The president says he wants to raise taxes by $1.6 trillion. And his Treasury Secretary suggests that Democrats are on board with this strategy. I don't believe that for 1 minute. I don't think his program would pass the Senate. And I don't think many Democrats would vote for it. I know at least 20 who won't. Yet the revenue generated by the proposals supported by real live Democrats seems to raise only between $353 billion and $383 billion. So here's the question. Where is the president going to come up with another $1.2 trillion or so in tax increases that his fellow Democrats will support? Now, we've seen 3 budgets the president has sent up, and they haven't received one vote from either Republicans or Democrats. Not one. Well, where is the president going to come up with another $1.2 trillion or so in tax increases and be able to get Democrats to support it? And I don't mean supported by Democrat pundits. I mean supported by the 20 Democratic senators who will be facing their constituents in 2014. The $1.6 trillion tax increase is lifted from the president's own budget that has been rejected on a bipartisan vote, 100% in both the House and the Senate. And that budget received no votes at all, Democrat or Republican, in either the House or the Senate. And as I said, it is the president's numbers, the numbers that Secretary Geithner was sent up here last week to promote, that don't add up. The president's insistence on a $1.6 trillion tax hike that is neither supported by the American people nor even elected Democrats is not about deficit reduction. The president and congressional Democrats think that they can bludgeon Republicans as an out-of-touch party of the rich because we support tax relief for everybody. Let me say a few words in our defense. First off, and I want to say this loud and clear, I could not care less about the financial well-being of the nation's rich. Whether Warren Buffett is able to maintain his corporate jet is no concern of mine, although he's a friend. The continued ability of actors and entertainment industry executives to summer at Lake Como and winter in St. Kitts is not on my list of priorities. In fact, I believe that when we do finally engage in fundamental tax reform, it is worth our while to look at how these super rich shelter their wealth from the full burden of income taxation, while the middle class continues to suffer under both the income tax and increasingly the alternative minimum tax, which is going to hit about 28 million regular people who are not millionaires on January 1st if we go over the cliff. Still, I, along with most of my Republican colleagues, continue to promote the seamless extension of current tax policy. That is because of the impact of increasing marginal rates on small business owners and the consequent impact on job creation and economic growth. We know that it's going to hit approximately 1 million small businesses very, very hard, most of whom put their monies back into the business so they can grow it and hire more people. Republicans support low marginal rates because we know that by raising rates, you hamper the efforts of investors, small business owners, and most importantly, the American workers they employ. Republicans are averse to rate hikes that would have a detrimental impact on people's livelihoods. We are averse to rate hikes that would undermine the prospects for fundamental tax reform that promotes fairness and economic growth. And we are certainly averse to a discussion about increased revenue in the absence of serious talk about spending reform, something that is not, except in minuscule ways, in the president's suggestions. Madam President, we keep hearing that Republicans are dug in on the issue of taxes and that their resistance to increase revenues is holding back the big balanced deal sought by the president. This has to be one of the most misreported stories in my memory. Many Republicans have stated openness to increased revenues. There is a difference between revenues and tax rate increases that we Republicans continue to point out. But only are we willing to be open to increase revenues as part of a balanced deal, and only if revenue increases are coupled with entitlement spending reform. Now, this brings me to my third guidepost for this debate. The President has shown a real stubbornness towards any reform of the spending programs that are the main drivers of our deficit and debt. We hear constantly about the intransigence of Republicans with their anti-tax rate views. Yet we do not see the same front-page stories documenting the over-my-dead-body resistance of Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, and the AARP toward entitlement spending structural reform, which everybody knows we've got to do if we're going to keep Medicare going. I don't think anybody in this body doesn't know that within 10 years it will be broke unless we make the appropriate structural reforms now. The President continues to call for a balanced approach to deficit reduction, but in practice he is offering up all tax increases and no spending discipline. He has offered up nothing meaningful on entitlement reform. The proposal put forward last week by Secretary Geithner was embarrassing. Now, I happen to like Secretary Geithner. I stood up for him under some trying circumstances on the Finance Committee before he was approved by the Senate. And I did it because I believe he's a hard worker, I believe he's an intelligent man, and I personally like him. But my gosh, if I was the Treasury Secretary and the President gave me that plan to go up and show it to the leader of the House, the Speaker of the House, I would have said, no, Mr. President, you can't do this. This is an insult. And if the President said, you got to do this for me, I would say, I think it's better for me to resign at this point. It's embarrassing. And I think Secretary Geithner knows it. And if he doesn't, then he's not the man that I have always thought he is. That proposal did nothing to address spending aside from wanting to increase it. But that's where the Democrats are. I understand the Democrats' predicament. Right after the election, it appeared that the door was open. The President seemed willing to address tax revenue in a responsible manner, a manner respectful of the legitimate concerns of the House majority and the 62.6 million individuals who did not vote for him. But within a week, he was read the riot act by the unions and the AARP, who will resist any meaningful changes to the entitlement spending programs that are now bankrupting our country. Later this week, I will outline a series of entitlement spending changes that could and should be supported on a bipartisan basis. The President told the American people that he wants a balanced approach. My hope is that the President comes forward on his own, with his own details on how he would fix the entitlement spending programs. And I mean real details on real proposals with real teeth, not the window dressing in the President's budget and even the Democrats reject and have rejected in the past. The President has demanded a balanced approach. It is what he promised the American people, and it is what we Republicans are prepared to give him. If the President wants to avoid going over the fiscal cliff, he can steer us away from it. The special interests in his liberal base will no doubt cry foul, but they will follow him if he will lead. And I don't see the leadership between you and me. Not to put too fine a point on it, but if we go over the cliff, it will be because the President wanted it to happen, and he thinks he'll get political points for doing it. And with the media in this country, the mainstream media, it's likely that they will ignore the actual facts here. even though the president will never again run for any public office, he will have put cheap political points ahead of a reasonable deal that he claims to support. Now, this is deeply cynical, and the president should understand that when the history of this episode is written, he will be portrayed not as a strong leader, but as one who wilted in the face of our generation's greatest challenge, caving to special interests over the well-being of the country. When he faced the choice of tough statesmanship or easy accolades from his house cable news network and a dead-ender base, he chose the latter. I think it's time for the president to start leading and to put away his campaign talking points and talk to us rather than talking from a toy factory trying to make his points. He needs to put away his campaign talking points. He needs to engage in finding a balanced solution to our debt crisis. He needs to lead the country, and he needs to protect American small business, their workers, and their children from an increasingly dim fiscal future. I'm concerned about it. And as I study it, the difference between the president's plan and what Senator McConnell and I suggested, putting it over for a year, giving us a year to do and dedicate that year to tax reform, the difference is about $23 billion, at the most $68 billion. And we're going to go over the cliff for $23 billion? We'd have to be nuts, even if our illustrious media will cover it up. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Iowa is recognized.
There's been a lot of discussion lately about how the Senate is not working properly. This is evidence to even a casual observer. On the other hand, to understand how the Senate was intended to work and what has gone wrong requires some knowledge of the history and the rules of the Senate, and I would put more emphasis upon the history than the present rules of the Senate, particularly the history and purpose of the Senate